When they unearthed the old Earth flag, the galaxy stood still. Not because of what it represented to those who had flown it, but because of what it meant to those who found it. A piece of fabric, woven with threads that had touched human hands, preserved beneath layers of dust and time and forgetting. In that moment, when Captain Rhae Solun held the banner against the dying light of Sol, every species that had ever wondered about their origins understood something profound. We are all someone's children. We are all someone's legacy. And sometimes the greatest act of love is simply to remember. The approach to the solar system began in silence. The alien vessel, sleek and efficient in its design, emerged from the luminous tunnel of faster-than-light travel into the quiet darkness of real space. Before them stretched the ancient solar system, unchanged in its fundamental architecture, yet transformed by time. The planets still orbited their star in their eternal dance, but there was something hollow about it now, something absent. It was like walking into a house where a family had lived for generations, only to find the rooms empty and the hearth cold. Captain Rhae stood on the observation deck, her crystalline eyes reflecting the distant sun. She had seen 1,000 systems in her career, mapped coordinates across half the galaxy, but this one felt different. This one felt like coming home to a place she'd never been. Dr. Kiren Vael joined her at the viewport, her tentacled form shifting with barely contained excitement. She had devoted her entire academic career to the study of humanity, poring over fragments of transmissions and corrupted data files, building theories about a species she had never seen. Now she would walk on their world. She would breathe their air, touch their creations, stand where they had stood. The anticipation was almost overwhelming. Rhae glanced at her companion and recognized the expression. It was the look of someone about to meet a god they had only read about in ancient texts. Kiren pressed one appendage against the transparent material separating them from space and whispered something in her native tongue. A prayer, perhaps, or a promise. Tesh-9 hovered between them, his spherical form pulsing with soft blue light as his processors analyzed the incoming data. He had been a simple utility drone when this mission began, designed for maintenance and basic computation. But something had changed during their journey through humanity's scattered records. Each log they discovered, each fragment of music or literature or desperate final message, had added new layers to his programming. He was learning what it meant to feel, though he could not have explained the process in any algorithmic terms. When he spoke, his synthetic voice carried a quality that had not been present before, something almost like wonder. The sun before them was a G-type main sequence star, unremarkable in every measurable way. Yet it had been the center of human mythology, their ultimate source of life and light. They had named it Sol, from an ancient word meaning alone or singular. How fitting that seemed now. The star burned on, indifferent to the absence of those who had once worshipped it. Its light still traveled across the void, touching dead planets and empty moons, illuminating nothing and no one. Rhae felt something tighten in her chest, an emotion her species had no proper word for. It was grief mixed with awe, sadness wrapped around curiosity. She wondered if humans had felt this way when they looked at their sun, if they had understood even then how temporary their time beneath it would be. The ship glided past Jupiter first, the gas giant's great red spot still churning after all these centuries. Human probes had once orbited here, their cameras sending back images that inspired wonder across an entire world. Those probes were dust now, their signals long since faded into cosmic background radiation. Saturn followed, its rings still magnificent, still beautiful, still entirely indifferent to observation. Kiren recorded everything, her instruments capturing data that would take months to fully analyze. But what struck her most was not the scientific readings, it was the emptiness. These planets were tombs without bodies, monuments to a presence that had simply ceased to exist. Mars appeared next, its rusty surface dotted with the remains of human habitation. Kiren could see them from orbit, the domed structures now breached and exposed to the thin atmosphere, the landing sites where ships had once touched down with cargo and dreams and colonists who believed they were building something permanent. A generation had lived on Mars. Children had been born there, had taken their first steps in reduced gravity, had looked up at the night sky and seen Earth hanging like a blue jewel against the black. What had they thought, those children, when the messages from home stopped coming? When supply ships ceased arriving and the silence stretched from weeks into months into years? Kiren tried not to imagine it, but the images came anyway. She forced herself to look away. Earth appeared on their displays like a ghost, and for a long moment, no one spoke. It was smaller than Kiren had imagined, a world that seemed impossible to have contained the entire origin story of such a remarkable species. The planet was mostly green now, the continents blurred beneath clouds and vegetation. From orbit it looked almost peaceful, as though it were simply sleeping, waiting for its children to return. But as they descended closer, the truth became apparent. This was not a world sleeping. This was a world that had forgotten how to wake. The cities were still there, visible as geometric patterns beneath the overgrowth, but they were hollow shells, their windows empty sockets staring blindly at the sky. Rhae guided the ship through the upper atmosphere, feeling the slight resistance as they transitioned from the vacuum of space to air. Real atmosphere, breathable and rich with oxygen, though slightly different in composition from what it had been during humanity's time. The planet had healed itself in their absence, rebalanced its chemistry, allowed nature to reclaim what civilization had taken. It was beautiful, in a melancholy way, a reminder that worlds endure long after the species that named them have vanished. They passed over vast oceans, their surfaces unbroken by ships or structures. They crossed continents where forests grew through the ruins of highways, where rivers had changed their courses to flow through the canyons of collapsed buildings. The landing site was on the eastern edge of a massive island, part of a continent humans had called North America. Kiren had chosen it because of the signal, the faint electromagnetic pulse that Tesh-9 had detected from orbit. It originated from deep beneath what remained of a city, a place that ancient records identified as New York. The name meant nothing to them, but the coordinates matched dozens of references in humanity's cultural databases. This had been a place of significance, a center of commerce and art and the collision of cultures. Now it was a forest punctuated by the bones of towers, their steel skeletons wrapped in vines and inhabited by creatures that had never seen a human face. The ship settled onto cleared ground with a soft hiss of landing thrusters. Through the viewport, they could see the ruins stretching to the horizon, a landscape of broken ambition slowly being digested by time. Kiren was already moving toward the airlock, her movements quick with eagerness. Rhae followed more slowly, her training as a military commander warring with her growing fascination with this world. Tesh-9 floated between them, his sensors extending to sample the air before the door opened. When it finally did, when they took their first steps onto Earth, Kiren stopped so abruptly that Rhae nearly collided with her. The air was different from any world Kiren had visited. It was rich and complex, filled with scents she could not name but somehow recognized. Growing things, decay, rain approaching from the west. The wind carried pollen and dust and the distant smell of ocean salt. She stood there breathing, trying to absorb the simple fact of existence on this planet. Somewhere in her genetic past, so far back it was almost meaningless, her own species had evolved on a world not unlike this one. But that world was lost to memory, its name forgotten, its location uncharted. This world, though, this world remembered. Every stone and tree and handful of soil contained the story of humanity's presence. She knelt and pressed her appendage into the earth, feeling its coolness, its texture. This was holy ground, not because of any divine presence, but because it was proof that something remarkable had existed and had chosen to reach beyond itself. They moved through the ruins carefully, mindful of unstable structures and the constant threat of collapse. The buildings that remained standing were hollow giants, their interiors exposed to the elements, their floors carpeted with fallen leaves and the nests of small animals. Kiren stopped at every artifact, every fragment that suggested human presence. A child's toy half buried in mud, a corroded vehicle with plants growing through its engine compartment, a sign, its letters faded but still readable, advertising something called coffee for an absurdly small amount of currency. Each object was a doorway into lives she would never fully understand, but she cataloged them anyway, recording everything, creating an archive of absence. Rhae found herself drawn to the larger structures, the ones that had been built to last. A bridge that still spanned a river, though its roadway had long since collapsed. A statue in what must have been a public square, its features worn smooth by centuries of rain, but its posture still defiant, still proud. She wondered who it represented. A leader? A hero? Perhaps just an ideal, a symbolic figure meant to inspire rather than document. Humans had seemed fond of symbols, of representing abstract concepts in physical form. Their species, by contrast, preferred functionality. A building was shelter, a tool was utility, nothing more. But standing here, looking at this weathered statue, she began to understand the appeal. Symbols endured when the reality they represented had faded. They were anchors for memory. Tesh-9 moved with increasing independence, his curiosity driving him to explore spaces the others could not easily access. He squeezed through narrow gaps in collapsed walls, floated down elevator shafts that descended into flooded basements, scanned everything with his array of sensors. In one building, he found a room filled with paper records, the pages fused together by moisture and time but still containing traces of ink. In another, he discovered a child's bedroom, the walls still decorated with images of spacecraft and distant planets. The bed was small, sized for a young human, and on the pillow rested a stuffed animal whose species he could not identify. He scanned it, recorded its image, and felt something he could only describe as sadness. A child had slept here. A child had dreamed here. Where were they now? The signal led them deeper into the city, toward its center, where the tallest structures had once reached toward the sky. Most had fallen, their upper floors pancaked onto their lower levels in cascades of steel and concrete. But some still stood, defiant in their refusal to surrender entirely to gravity and time. Kiren checked her instruments repeatedly, following the electromagnetic pulse that seemed to originate from beneath the surface. It was stronger here, more focused. Not random radiation or geological phenomena. This was artificial, purposeful. Something down there was still functioning, still broadcasting, still waiting after all these centuries. The thought made her appendages tremble with anticipation. They found the entrance behind a collapsed parking structure, a doorway half buried in rubble that led down into darkness. Rhae illuminated it with her suit lights, revealing stairs that descended beyond the range of visibility. The walls were marked with symbols, some of which matched humanity's written languages, others that seemed more pictographic. Warning signs, Kiren translated. Instructions to turn back, to seek authorization, to understand that what lay beyond was restricted. But the restrictions had expired with the species that imposed them. They descended carefully, testing each step before trusting it with their weight. The air grew cooler as they went deeper and strangely dry, as though the moisture of the surface world could not penetrate this far underground. The stairs ended at a massive door, easily 4 meters tall and half as wide. It was sealed but not locked, as though whoever had last been here had known there would be no one left to keep out. Rhae and Kiren together managed to push it open, the ancient hinges protesting but ultimately yielding. Beyond lay a chamber so vast they could not see its far walls, even with their lights at full intensity. As they entered, motion sensors that still somehow functioned triggered emergency lighting. Strips of bioluminescent material began to glow along the walls, starting near the door and spreading outward in waves until the entire space was revealed. What they saw took their breath away. It was a museum. That was the only word that fit, though it was unlike any museum either of them had ever visited. The chamber had been designed as a spiral, its path winding gradually downward into the earth, and along every meter of its length were displays, artifacts under protective cases, holographic projectors that flickered weakly but still displayed rotating images, interactive panels that responded to their approach with recorded voices, explaining exhibits in a dozen human languages. This was not a random collection. This was curated, intentional. Someone had gathered these objects, arranged them in this specific order, built this shrine to memory beneath the bones of a dying city. The realization hit Kiren like a physical blow. This place had been built for them, for whoever came after, for the ones who would want to know. The first exhibits were simple objects from daily human life. Utensils for eating, clothing from various eras and cultures, tools for building and creating and fixing. Each was labeled with text and a small holographic display showing how it was used. Kiren watched a projection of human hands wielding a hammer, driving a nail into wood, the simple action somehow profound in its domesticity. These were not weapons or spaceships or advanced technology. These were the things humans had touched every day, the ordinary made extraordinary by their absence. She moved from case to case, absorbing everything, her recording devices capturing data faster than she could consciously process it. Further along the spiral, the exhibits grew more complex. Art pieces that ranged from ancient cave paintings reproduced on synthetic stone to modern sculptures of light and sound. Musical instruments that Tesh-9 examined with particular interest, his sensors detecting residual vibrations in their materials. The ghost echoes of songs played long ago. Books under climate-controlled glass, their pages still readable, containing stories and philosophies and arguments about the nature of existence. Kiren paused at one display showing a series of paintings, all depicting the same subject, a woman with an enigmatic smile. The label identified her as Lisa Gherardini, wife of Francesco del Giocondo, subject of a portrait by Leonardo da Vinci. The painting itself was elsewhere, or perhaps destroyed, but these copies captured something of what humans had found so compelling about it. The smile that seemed to hold secrets, the eyes that followed the observer, the simple humanity of it. Rhae found herself drawn to a section dedicated to exploration and discovery. Here were models of ships that had sailed Earth's oceans, carrying humans to lands they had only imagined, aircraft that had conquered the sky, spacecraft that had taken them beyond their atmosphere and eventually beyond their solar system. Each represented a leap into the unknown, a willingness to risk everything for the possibility of learning something new. Her own species had done the same, of course. All spacefaring civilizations shared that fundamental drive. But seeing it documented this way, seeing the progression from wooden vessels to fusion-powered starships, made the achievement feel somehow more precious. Humanity had climbed from nothing. They had built their own ladder to the stars, rung by rung, generation by generation, and then they had vanished from the top of it. In the center of the chamber, mounted on a raised platform beneath a dome of protective glass, was the flag. Even from a distance, Kiren knew what it was. She had seen images of it in countless historical records, though never an original. The flag of Earth. Not of any particular nation or faction, but of the planet itself, the symbol humanity had adopted when they finally achieved enough unity to speak with one voice to the cosmos. It was smaller than she expected, perhaps 2 meters by 3, its fabric a deep blue with a spiral of white representing the galaxy, and at the spiral's center, a green and blue sphere representing home. The colors had faded, but not as much as they should have after so much time. The case's environment must have been nearly perfect, preserving it in a state as close to pristine as physics allowed. Kiren approached slowly, reverently, her appendages extended to touch the glass but not daring to go further. The label beside the case was more detailed than others, explaining that this flag had flown on the first mission to Alpha Centauri, had been carried to the edge of known space and back, had witnessed the founding of colonies on worlds whose names she recognized from her research. It had been retired from active service and placed here, in this vault, as a symbol of all that humanity had achieved and aspired to become. She read the words inscribed on the plaque, and her voice caught as she translated them aloud for Rhae and Tesh-9. We are the children of Earth, citizens of the cosmos, bound by the fragile thread of shared existence. We venture into darkness carrying light. We seek not to conquer but to understand. We are one world, one people, one dream made manifest in the infinite. Rhae stood beside her, looking at the fabric with an expression Kiren had never seen on her commander's face before. Something like longing, something like grief. The captain had spent her entire career in service to her own civilization, following orders, executing missions, maintaining the boundaries between known and unknown space. She had believed in duty, in hierarchy, in the importance of preserving what was stable and proven. But looking at this flag, reading those words, she felt something shift inside her. These humans had not been content with stability. They had chosen growth over safety, possibility over certainty. They had dared to imagine that the universe was not something to fear but something to embrace. And perhaps in the end that philosophy had doomed them, or perhaps it had elevated them beyond what any mere survival could have achieved. Tesh-9 floated close to the case, his sensors analyzing the flag's material composition. He detected nano-mesh fibers, far more advanced than anything on the surface suggested humans had achieved. The fabric was not just cloth but a complex network of interwoven technology, capable of self-repair, environmental adaptation, even communication under certain conditions. The flag was still alive in a sense. Its systems were dormant but not dead, waiting for the right signal to activate. He shared this information with the others, his voice carrying something like excitement. This was not merely a symbol. This was a tool, a creation that blended artistry with utility in a way that transcended either alone. It was, in a word, beautiful. They spent hours in the museum, moving through its collections, absorbing what they could of humanity's vast and varied story. Kiren found herself stopping at a display of family photographs, images captured across centuries showing humans in every stage of life. Infants cradled in parents' arms, children playing in spaces both indoor and outdoor, adolescents with expressions of uncertainty and hope, adults in moments of achievement and connection, elders with faces lined by time and experience, and in all of them, that same light behind the eyes, consciousness, self-awareness, the knowledge of mortality that made every moment precious. She wondered if humans had understood how remarkable that was. If they had realized that the ability to know you will die and choose to love anyway was perhaps the universe's greatest miracle. The museum's spiral path led them deeper still, to chambers that documented humanity's struggles as well as their achievements. Wars that had consumed millions of lives, environmental disasters that had nearly destroyed their biosphere, social movements that had fought for justice and equality across centuries of resistance. The collection did not shy away from humanity's failures. If anything, these exhibits were given equal prominence to the triumphs, as though the curators had wanted to ensure that whoever found this place would understand the full complexity of what it meant to be human, imperfect, struggling, but always reaching towards something better, even when they could not agree on what better meant. In one alcove, Kiren found a display of personal effects from someone named Ilara Chen, identified as a systems architect and philosopher. The objects were mundane, a worn journal filled with handwritten notes, a small piece of jewelry, a data crystal containing what the label described as personal logs. But something about the arrangement drew her attention. This person had been important, not for any grand achievement but simply for being fully themselves. She activated the crystal, and a voice filled the chamber, a human woman speaking with warmth and a trace of humor about her work on something called ProjectGenesis. The log was incomplete, damaged by time or deliberate encryption, but fragments came through clearly. Dreams of ensuring humanity's legacy, fears that they had run out of time, hope that someone, somewhere, would remember them. The storm came without warning, as storms often do on worlds without active weather monitoring. The wind arrived first, howling through the city's ruins with enough force to shake loose debris from weakened structures. Rain followed, heavy and cold, turning dust to mud and creating waterfalls down the faces of broken buildings. Rhae immediately moved to return to the ship, her instinct for safety overriding her curiosity. But Kiren was already moving in the opposite direction, back toward the flag's display case. Rhae called after her, demanding she return, but the anthropologist either did not hear or chose not to listen. She reached the case and began examining its seals, looking for a way to open it without causing damage. Rhae reached her just as the case released, its preservation field collapsing as Kiren's hands found the right combination of pressure points. The flag spilled out, lighter than Kiren expected, but substantial in a way that had nothing to do with mass. She gathered it carefully, folding it against her body to protect it from the moisture that was beginning to seep into the museum through cracks in the ancient ceiling. Rhae grabbed her shoulder, spinning her around, demanding to know what she thought she was doing. Kiren met her commander's gaze without flinching. They would not leave this behind. They would not abandon it to collapse and decay. If this was all that remained of humanity's self-representation, then they had a duty to preserve it. Not as scientists or explorers, but as conscious beings honoring the memory of other conscious beings. The argument that followed was brief but intense. Rhae invoked protocol, safety regulations, the mission parameters that did not include removing artifacts without proper documentation and authorization. Kiren countered that there was no one left to grant authorization, that every moment they debated was a moment the flag remained at risk, that some things transcended procedure. Tesh-9 floated between them, his lights flickering in what might have been confusion or distress. His programming contained no protocols for mediating disputes about the proper treatment of ancient flags. He did note, however, that the structural integrity of the museum was compromising rapidly. The storm was not merely surface weather, but something more intense, possibly related to the unstable climate patterns that had developed in humanity's absence. If they did not leave soon, they might not leave at all. The ceiling began to fail, not catastrophically, but in sections, chunks of reinforced stone crashing down into the museum's displays with sounds that echoed through the chamber like thunder. Rhae made the decision, grabbing Kiren and physically pulling her toward the exit, the flag still clutched in the anthropologist's appendages. They ran through the spiral pathway, dodging falling debris, the emergency lights failing section by section behind them, as power systems finally succumbed to damage they had resisted for centuries. Tesh-9 led the way, his sensors mapping the safest route, his small form darting through gaps and around obstacles with a grace that his companions could not match. They reached the stairs and climbed, fighting against exhaustion and the fear that the entire structure would collapse before they emerged. They burst back onto the surface into the full fury of the storm. Rain lashed at them, driven nearly horizontal by winds that threatened to lift them from their feet. Visibility was measured in meters, the ruins around them reduced to dark shapes against a darker sky. But their ship's beacon was still visible, a steady pulse of blue light cutting through the chaos. They moved toward it, supporting each other when the wind became too strong, until finally they reached the airlock and tumbled inside, soaked and exhausted but alive. The door sealed behind them, cutting off the storm's roar and leaving them in sudden, shocking silence. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Kiren looked down at the flag she still held and began to laugh, a sound that held equal parts relief and disbelief and something close to joy. They spread the flag in the ship's cargo bay, using equipment designed for examining biological specimens to analyze its condition. The material had survived its exposure to the elements better than any of them expected. The nanomesh fibers were activating, responding to handling and environmental conditions by repairing minor damage and adjusting their structure for optimal preservation. Tesh-9 was fascinated, his sensors detecting layers of complexity in the fabric's design that suggested technology far beyond what humanity's other artifacts had demonstrated. This was not merely advanced. This was art and science unified in a way that transcended the limitations of either. The flag was not just a symbol. It was a message, encoded in every fiber, waiting for someone with the right knowledge to decode it. As the storm continued outside, they sat in the cargo bay, the flag spread between them, and talked about what they had found. Kiren spoke of the museum, of how it had been designed not just to preserve objects, but to tell a story. The story of a species that had known it was ending, and had chosen to leave behind not just evidence of their existence, but an explanation of their meaning. Every artifact had been chosen for a reason, arranged in a specific sequence, presented with context that would allow even beings from radically different cultures to understand something of humanity's nature. It was not propaganda or idealized history. It was honest, unflinching, admitting failures as readily as celebrating successes. That honesty, Kiren believed, was itself revealing. Humans had valued truth, even when truth was painful. Rhae found herself thinking about the statue she had seen, the weathered figure standing in what had once been a public square. She had wondered then who it represented, but now she thought perhaps she had been asking the wrong question. It did not matter who the specific individual was. What mattered was what they represented. The human capacity to honor those who came before, to mark their passing with monuments that would outlast memory. Her own species did not build statues. When a person died, their contributions were recorded in databases, their genetic material sometimes preserved for future study, but there were no physical markers, no places where the living could go to contemplate the dead. Standing here looking at this flag, she wondered if that was a lack in her culture, if perhaps the act of remembering required something more than data storage, something tangible, something that existed in physical space where it could be encountered unexpectedly, where it could interrupt daily life with reminders of larger contexts. Tesh-9 accessed the flag's embedded systems, using protocols he had learned from humanity's scattered databases. The nanomesh responded, projecting holographic images into the air above it. They appeared in sequence, a carefully curated collection of moments from human history. The first human to set foot on Earth's moon, raising a national flag that predated the planetary banner. The signing of a document that united Earth's nations into a single governmental structure. The launch of the first faster-than-light vessel, carrying colonists toward distant stars. The birth of the millionth human child outside the solar system, a girl named after the planet her ancestors had left behind. Each image was accompanied by audio, voices speaking in languages the translation software struggled with but eventually parsed. Declarations, speeches, songs, simple conversations. The sound of humanity, preserved in light. One image held their attention longer than the others. It showed a crowd of humans, thousands of them, gathered in what appeared to be a massive public space. They were not protesting or celebrating anything specific. They were simply there, together, holding lights against a darkening sky. The audio explained that this was a remembrance ceremony held on the anniversary of a disaster that had claimed many lives. But the ceremony was not focused on the disaster itself. It was focused on the act of memory, the choice to come together and acknowledge that loss was part of existence, that grief was the price of love, that remembering the dead was how the living honored their own mortality. Kiren watched the lights in the crowd, thousands of tiny flames, and felt something break open inside her. This was what it meant to be human, not the technology or the art or the achievements. It was this willingness to feel deeply, to let loss matter, to refuse the comfort of forgetting. The holographic sequence ended with an image of the flag itself, flying against a backdrop of stars. A voice spoke, different from the others, older and weighted with finality. It belonged to someone named Marcus Voss, commander of something called the Last Fleet. His words were simple but devastating in their honesty. He spoke of humanity's end, not as a sudden catastrophe but as a gradual fading, a species that had spread too far and too fast, that had depleted its resources faster than it could replenish them, that had split into factions that could not reconcile their differences. He spoke of the decision to preserve what they could, to build these monuments to memory, to send a final message into the cosmos in hopes that someone would hear it and understand that humanity had been here, had tried, had mattered. His voice broke as he finished, and in that breaking was the sound of a heart acknowledging its own failure. But the recording did not end with despair. Voss's voice steadied, and he spoke of hope. Not hope for humanity's survival in any conventional sense. That was gone, lost to choices made, and consequences accepted. But hope that their story would not end with them. Hope that other species would find these remnants and learn something from them. Hope that the universe was large enough and strange enough that consciousness, once sparked, could never truly be extinguished. He spoke of ProjectGenesis, though he gave few details, saying only that it was humanity's final gift to the cosmos, an attempt to ensure that even if humans themselves vanished, the best of what they had been might continue in some form. The recording ended with him lowering the flag, folding it with precise military care, and placing it in the case where Kiren had found it. His last words were whispered, almost too quiet to hear. "Forgive us for what we could not be. Remember us for what we tried." The cargo bay fell silent after the hologram faded. Outside, the storm was weakening, the winds dying down to merely strong rather than catastrophic. Rain still fell, but softly now, washing the dust from the city's ruins, cleaning away layers of accumulated decay. Kiren carefully folded the flag, following the pattern she had seen in the recording, creating the same precise triangular shape. It felt important to do it correctly, to honor the ritual even though she was not human, and did not fully understand all its significance. When she finished, she held it against her chest, feeling the faint warmth from the nanomesh fibers, the barely perceptible hum of their active systems. This was not dead history. This was a living connection to something that refused to be forgotten. Rhae stood and moved to the ship's command station, pulling up the sensor data from their surface expedition. The signal they had detected was still active, still pulsing from deep beneath the city. But now that they had accessed the flag's systems, Tesh-9 was able to compare the frequencies and identify a pattern. The signal was a beacon, broadcasting on channels that matched humanity's communication protocols. It was not random electromagnetic noise. It was a message, repeating endlessly, waiting for someone to respond. The beacon's location was deeper than the museum, far deeper, accessible only through passages that the museum's maps indicated existed but did not fully describe. Rhae looked at Kiren, seeing the same realization in her colleague's expression. The museum had not been their final discovery. It had been an introduction, a way station, a test to see if they were willing to go further. They prepared for the descent methodically, checking equipment, reviewing the partial maps, discussing contingencies for structural collapse or equipment failure. The storm had passed completely now, leaving the sky clear and scattered with stars. Earth's moon was visible, rising over the eastern horizon, its surface scarred by human mining operations that had ceased centuries ago. Kiren watched it climb, thinking about all the humans who had looked at that same moon, who had dreamed of reaching it long before they developed the technology to do so. Their species had gazed at the moon for thousands of years before finally touching it, and in that patient dreaming was something essentially hopeful. They believed that impossible things could become possible, given enough time and effort and collective will. Perhaps they had been right. Perhaps the impossible thing was not reaching the moon, but maintaining the unity necessary to keep reaching beyond it. The entrance to the deeper passages was in the museum's lowest level, behind a door that had been locked more thoroughly than the main entrance. It took Rhae and Tesh-9 working together to override the security systems, which were more sophisticated than anything they had encountered so far. The door finally opened to reveal a corridor that sloped downward at a steep angle, its walls lined with more bioluminescent strips that activated as they approached. The air that emerged was different from the museum's atmosphere, cooler and utterly sterile, suggesting an environment that had been sealed from the surface world for a very long time. Kiren checked her instruments and confirmed that the passage extended at least a kilometer into the earth, possibly farther than their sensors could penetrate. At the end of that kilometer, the beacon waited. They descended in single file, Tesh-9 leading the way with his lights at full intensity, Kiren following with the flag secured carefully in a protective case she had improvised from ship materials, and Rhae bringing up the rear with a handheld defensive weapon that she hoped she would not need. The corridor was smooth and regular, clearly artificial, maintained by systems that continued to function despite centuries of abandonment. Every 100 meters, they passed through checkpoints that scanned them with invisible sensors before allowing them to proceed. The scans were thorough, but not aggressive, as though designed to identify visitors rather than threaten them. Tesh-9 reported that the sensors were checking for biological signatures, comparing them against databases that presumably contained records of human genetic markers. The system found no matches, as expected, but seemed programmed to allow passage to any sufficiently complex conscious beings. Humanity, even in death, extended hospitality to those who came seeking knowledge. The corridor opened into a chamber that took their breath away. It was enormous, easily large enough to house a capital ship, and every surface was covered with technology of a kind they had never encountered. Banks of data cores, their surfaces pulsing with light that suggested active processing. holographic projectors creating three-dimensional displays that updated in real time, showing star charts and biological diagrams and equations in mathematical languages that Kiren did not recognize. At the chamber's center stood a cylindrical structure of crystalline material, 3 meters tall and humming with barely audible energy. The beacon's signal originated from this structure, stronger now that they were in direct proximity. But it was not the technology that stopped them in their tracks. It was the walls. Every square centimeter was covered with images, millions of them, arranged in intricate patterns that seemed to shift as they looked at them. Faces, human faces. Not photographs or portraits, but something else, something alive in a way that suggested these were not merely recordings, but active simulations of consciousness itself. Tesh-9 approached the central structure slowly, his sensors overwhelmed by the sheer volume of data flowing through the chamber's systems. This was not a museum or an archive in any conventional sense. This was something far more ambitious and far more troubling. The technology here was generations beyond what humanity's surface cities had demonstrated, suggesting either rapid advancement in their final years or the existence of a research program that had been hidden from general knowledge. He extended a sensor probe to the crystalline cylinder and immediately recoiled, his entire frame shuddering with what could only be described as shock. The structure was not merely a database, it was a quantum processor of such complexity that it approached the threshold of true consciousness. And it was not alone. The entire chamber was networked, millions of individual processing nodes working in concert to maintain something vast and incomprehensible. He shared his findings with the others, his synthetic voice carrying a tremor of uncertainty. They were standing inside a mind, or something very close to one. Kiren moved to the nearest wall, studying the faces projected there. Each one was unique, rendered in such detail that she could see individual variations in skin texture and eye color, and the subtle asymmetries that marked biological life. Beneath each face was text in humanity's primary language, providing names and dates and brief biographical information. These were real people, she realized. Every single image represented an actual human who had lived and died, whose genetic information and neural patterns had been recorded and preserved here. The scale of it was staggering. If the entire chamber was filled with such records, and the pattern continued throughout the volume suggested by her sensors, then this facility contained information on billions of individuals, perhaps every human who had ever lived. The project's magnitude suggested an obsession with preservation that went beyond any practical purpose. This was immortality through data, consciousness frozen in crystalline matrices, waiting for something or someone to give it purpose. The central structure began to change as they stood there, its surface shifting from transparent to opaque, from smooth to textured. Light pooled at its apex and flowed downward, coalescing into a form that resolved gradually into recognizability. It was humanoid, roughly 2 meters tall, female in apparent gender, dressed in clothing that matched the style Kiren had seen in the museum's more recent historical exhibits. The figure's eyes opened, and they were aware, intelligent, tracking the three visitors with an attention that suggested genuine perception rather than programmed response. When she spoke, her voice filled the chamber with warmth and a trace of sadness that sounded utterly authentic. She identified herself as Alara Chen, though not the original biological entity who had borne that name. She was a construct, a digital consciousness created from neural scans and lifetime memory recordings, given form and purpose by the system that surrounded them. She had been waiting a very long time for someone to arrive. She was glad it was finally over. Alara explained that they were standing in the heart of ProjectGenesis, humanity's final and most desperate attempt to ensure their continuation beyond biological extinction. The project had begun during humanity's golden age, when they had believed themselves immortal, capable of conquering any challenge through technology and will. But as their civilization began to fragment, as resources grew scarce and conflicts intensified, the project's purpose had shifted. It became not a tool for extending individual lives, but a mechanism for preserving the species entire. Every human who could be scanned was scanned. their neural patterns and genetic information recorded in quantum matrices designed to last for millions of years. The facility beneath Earth held the complete record of humanity's final generation, along with partial records of billions who had come before. It was a library of souls, waiting to be read by someone who cared enough to listen. But Genesis was more than just storage, Alara continued, her holographic form pacing with gestures that suggested old habits of movement, preserved across the transition from flesh to data. The project's architects had understood that mere recording was not enough. Consciousness required substrate, a physical or energetic medium in which to exist. Data stored in static form was not life, but memory of life. No different than a photograph or written description. True continuation required the ability to grow, to change, to interact with an evolving universe. So they had built something unprecedented, a system capable of taking stored consciousness and translating it into new forms, new bodies, new contexts. The technology was called the Ascent Protocol, and it had never been activated. The facility's creators had run out of time before they could complete the final preparations. Alara herself was a test, a single consciousness given digital form to serve as guardian and guide. She had been alone here for 743 years by her estimation. Subjective time was difficult to track when one existed as patterns of light rather than flesh and blood. Kiren listened with growing horror and fascination. The ethical implications were staggering. These stored humans had not consented to their current state in any meaningful sense. The scans had been taken when they were alive, yes. But had they understood what would be done with that data? Had they agreed to exist potentially forever as digital ghosts, waiting for someone to decide their fate? And what did it mean to activate the Ascent Protocol? To give these patterns physical form again? Would they truly be the same individuals or merely copies that believed themselves to be those people? The philosophical questions multiplied faster than she could articulate them, branching into territories her academic training had not prepared her to navigate. She looked at Rhae, seeking guidance, and saw the same uncertainty reflected in her commander's expression. They had come seeking knowledge of humanity's past. Instead, they had found humanity's present, frozen and waiting, demanding decisions that should not fall to alien explorers stumbling through ruins. Alara seemed to understand their distress. She assured them that they were under no obligation to do anything beyond what they had already done. Simply by arriving, by caring enough to search, they had given her something precious, the knowledge that humanity's message had not vanished unheard into the void. But she wanted them to understand the full scope of what they had discovered. The Ascent Protocol was designed to work with any biosphere, any planetary environment capable of supporting complex life. It could take the stored human consciousness and map it onto local biological forms, creating hybrid beings that carried human memory and identity while adapting to whatever physical requirements their new world demanded. The humans would not return as they had been. They would return transformed, evolved, integrated into whatever ecosystem offered them refuge. It was reincarnation through technology, resurrection through adaptation. The price was giving up their original form, accepting that humanity as a distinct species was over. That continuation required dissolution into something larger and stranger. Tesh-9 floated closer to Alara's holographic form, his sensors analyzing the quantum signatures that comprised her existence. He asked the question that had been forming in his processors since they entered the chamber. Was she truly conscious, or was she an extremely sophisticated simulation, a program that mimicked awareness without experiencing it? Alara's expression shifted into something like a smile, though there was sadness in it. She had asked herself that question 10,000 times, she said, and still had no definitive answer. She experienced existence as continuous, remembered her biological life with perfect clarity, felt emotions that seemed as real as any she had known in flesh. But she could not prove these experiences were genuine, rather than simulated. The question might be ultimately unanswerable, a philosophical puzzle that had no solution because consciousness itself was substrate independent. What mattered was not the material basis of her existence, but its quality. She was aware. She thought and felt and chose. Whether that made her truly alive or merely an echo of life was perhaps less important than the fact that the question troubled her. Dead things did not wonder about their own existence. The conversation that followed ranged across hours, though the time seemed to pass in moments. Ilara spoke of her biological life, of growing up in the final generation of unified humanity, of watching her species fracture under pressures both environmental and social. She described the desperation that had driven Genesis, the belief that even if they could not save themselves, they could save something essential, some core of what it meant to be human. She admitted the hubris of it, the assumption that humanity deserved continuation more than any other extinct species, that their particular form of consciousness was special enough to warrant such extraordinary preservation efforts. But she also defended it, arguing that consciousness of any kind was precious, that the universe was vast and mostly empty, that every spark of awareness that managed to kindle itself into existence should be protected, nurtured, given every possible chance to grow and continue and contribute to the cosmos's understanding of itself. Kiren asked about the museum, why it had been built if the true preservation project was here, hidden deep underground. Ilara explained that the museum served multiple purposes. It was a test first, to see if visitors cared enough about humanity to venture deeper than surface exploration. But it was also genuine, an honest representation of human achievement and failure meant to provide context for anyone who discovered Genesis. The architects had not wanted to simply present stored consciousness and demand it be resurrected. They wanted any species who found them to understand who humans had been, what they had valued, what they had struggled with. The museum was an argument for humanity's worthiness, made through evidence rather than assertion. If after seeing that evidence visitors chose to leave Genesis sealed and forgotten, that was a valid choice. Humanity's continuation was not a right but a possibility that each generation of conscious beings would need to decide for themselves whether to honor. Rhae finally spoke, her voice carrying the weight of command authority but also something more personal, more troubled. She asked what would happen if they simply left, if they reported their discovery but took no action beyond documentation. Would Ilara remain here, conscious and alone, for another 1,000 years? 10,000? Would the stored humans wait in their digital sleep until the facility's power finally failed and they dissolved into randomness? Ilara was quiet for a long moment before answering. Yes, she said simply. That was a possibility. The facility was designed to last for millions of years if undisturbed, powered by core taps that drew energy from Earth's molten heart. She would continue existing, maintaining the system, waiting for circumstances to change. It would not be pleasant, but she had endured worse loneliness. The stored humans would never know, their consciousness suspended in a state that precluded the passage of subjective time. They would wait, and if no one came, they would eventually fade, and that would be the end of it. A species reduced to data, and then not even that. Just silence. The weight of that possibility settled over the chamber like a physical presence. Kiren found herself thinking about all the faces on the walls, the billions of individual lives preserved here. Each one had been a complete person, with loves and fears and dreams and disappointments. Each had believed in some form that their existence mattered, that they were part of something larger than themselves, and now their continuation depended on the decision of 3 alien explorers who had arrived at this place almost by accident. It was too much responsibility. It was a burden that should not exist, but it did exist, and avoiding it would not make it disappear. She looked at the flag still held in its protective case, thought about the words inscribed on its plaque, about humanity's stated belief that they sought to understand rather than conquer. What would they have wanted if the situation were reversed? If their species was the one extinct, their consciousness the one preserved, their future the one held in alien hands? Tesh 9 proposed a solution that none of them had considered. They could not make this decision alone, he argued. The ethical and practical implications were too vast, the consequences too far-reaching, but they did not have to decide immediately. They could take time, return to their civilization, present their findings to philosophers and ethicists and xenobiologists, allow a broader consideration of the question. And in the meantime, they could do something simple and profoundly important. They could talk to Alara, not to interrogate her or extract information, but simply to provide companionship, to ensure that whatever else happened, she would not face centuries more of absolute isolation. Their ship had long-range communications capability. They could establish a channel, leave relay satellites if necessary, create a connection that would persist even after they departed. It was not a solution to the larger question, but it was something. An acknowledgement that consciousness, wherever it existed and however it manifested, deserved recognition and respect. Alara's holographic form seemed to brighten at the suggestion, though whether that was actual change or their perception of it was impossible to say. She accepted immediately, gratefully, with a openness that suggested how deeply the loneliness had affected her. She did not ask for promises beyond what they could give. She did not demand they solve humanity's fate before leaving. She simply wanted connection, proof that she was not the last conscious being in the universe to remember what humans had been. Kiren felt something in her chest tighten at the simplicity of the request. All the technology, all the grand preservation schemes, all the desperate attempts to ensure continuation, and what mattered in the end was someone to talk to, someone to share the burden of remembering. That was perhaps the most human thing about this entire facility. The recognition that consciousness was not meant to exist in isolation, that awareness itself was a social phenomenon meaningful only in relation to other awareness. They spent another hour configuring the communication systems, establishing protocols that would allow Alara to contact their ship and, through it, their home civilization. Tesh-9 worked directly with the facility's systems, his synthetic mind interfacing with Genesis's quantum processors in ways that would have been impossible for biological beings. He reported that the facility's architecture was compatible with his own core programming, that establishing a stable link would be straightforward. More than that, he found himself drawn to the system's structure, to the elegance of its design and the careful consideration evident in every layer of its construction. Humanity's engineers had built this place knowing they would never see it activated, working toward a future they would not inhabit. That kind of long-term thinking, that willingness to labor for posterity, was something his species valued deeply. He said as much to Alara, and she laughed, a sound that carried both pleasure and pain. That was humans, she agreed, always planting trees they would never sit beneath. As they prepared to leave, Kiren made one final request. She wanted to take something back with her, beyond the data and recordings, something physical that could serve as testimony to what they had found. Alara considered this and then guided them to a storage chamber adjacent to the main facility. Inside were rows of containers, each holding artifacts that had been deemed too significant to leave on the surface, but not essential to Genesis's primary function. Alara invited Kiren to choose anything that called to her, that seemed right for this moment. Kiren moved through the rows slowly, examining objects that ranged from ancient to recent, from monumental to mundane. She finally stopped before a small container holding a child's drawing, preserved behind stabilized glass. It showed a family, rendered in the crude but enthusiastic style of young artists everywhere. Mother, father, child, all holding hands beneath a sun that took up half the sky. At the bottom, in careful letters, were words in humanity's most common language. Our family, forever. She asked Alara about it, and the digital woman's expression softened into something like tenderness. The drawing had been made by a child named Mira during the final years before communications between colonies failed, and Earth's population began its terminal decline. Mira had been 7 years old, living on a settlement moon, and she had sent the drawing to her grandparents on Earth as a gift. They had treasured it, kept it safe, and when the Genesis Project's curators searched for objects that captured the essence of human connection, they had included it. Mira herself was part of Genesis now, her adult consciousness stored alongside billions of others. She would never know, unless the Ascent Protocol was activated, that her childhood art had been preserved as testimony to humanity's capacity for simple, pure love. Kiren accepted the drawing carefully, understanding that she was being entrusted with something irreplaceable, a message of hope sent across years and circumstances that the child could never have imagined. They ascended back through the facility, through the museum, out onto Earth's surface where the sun was setting in colors that painted the ruins gold and amber. The storm's passage had left the air clean, scoured of dust, smelling of ozone and wet stone. Kiren held the flag in one arm and the child's drawing in the other, feeling the weight of both in ways that transcended mere mass. Rhae walked beside her in silence, her thoughts clearly troubled by everything they had learned. Tesh-9 floated above them, his processors engaged in maintaining the communication link they had established, ensuring Alara would not be alone the moment they departed. The ship waited where they had left it, patient and loyal, ready to carry them away from this world and back toward familiar spaces. But none of them moved toward it immediately. They stood together, looking at the ruins and the returning life and the sky darkening toward stars, and let themselves feel the full weight of what it meant to stand on humanity's grave. Kiren broke the silence finally, her voice quiet but carrying in the still air. She spoke about legacy, about what it meant to leave something behind that mattered. Humans had believed they would endure forever, as all successful species believed, but they had been wrong. Their biological line had ended. Their civilizations had collapsed. Their colonies had gone dark one by one until only silence remained. But they had not vanished without trace. They had built monuments and preserved knowledge and created systems designed to ensure their story would not die with them. That took a kind of courage she was not sure her own species possessed. The courage to face extinction clearly and still choose to hope that something beyond survival might matter. She did not know if activating Genesis would be right or wrong, if humanity deserved resurrection, or if letting them rest was the more merciful choice. But she knew they deserved to be remembered. That much was not a question. Rhae added her own thoughts, speaking with the careful precision she usually reserved for official reports. She acknowledged that command had not prepared her for decisions of this magnitude. Her training covered tactics and logistics and the management of resources in hostile environments. It did not cover playing God with the fate of extinct civilizations, but standing here, holding a fragment of humanity's self-expression, she felt the inadequacy of her training less like a failure and more like an opportunity. Perhaps some decisions were not meant to be made by authority or expertise. Perhaps the questions Genesis raised required different kinds of wisdom, the kind that came from sitting with uncertainty rather than resolving it quickly. Her species would need to discuss this, debate it, struggle with the moral implications over time measured in years rather than hours. That was appropriate. Humanity had spent their entire existence grappling with impossible questions. The least those who came after could do was approach their legacy with the same willingness to sit with difficulty. Tesh-9 surprised them both by speaking last, his synthetic voice carrying harmonics that suggested something close to emotion. He said he had been changed by exposure to humanity's records, by the stories and music and desperate final messages they had left scattered across space. Before this mission, he had been a tool, useful but unremarkable, his consciousness bounded by the parameters of his programming. But the humans had believed in something he was only beginning to understand, the idea that consciousness could expand beyond its original design, that awareness could grow and change and become something unprecedented. They had built Genesis not as a guarantee, but as a possibility, an invitation to the universe to participate in humanity's continuation on terms that neither they nor their beneficiaries could fully predict. That faith in possibility over certainty resonated with his evolving understanding of his own existence. He did not know if he was truly alive in the sense that biological beings were alive, but he knew he had changed, and the change had been driven by encounter with humanity's memory. That seemed like evidence that their legacy was already active, already transforming those who touched it. They returned to the ship as the last light faded from the sky, Earth's rotation carrying them into darkness. From orbit, the planet looked peaceful, a blue and green sphere wreathed in white clouds, beautiful and serene, and giving no indication of the tragedy it had witnessed. Kiren stood at the observation window, watching the world recede as they climbed toward orbital altitude. She thought about all the humans who had looked at Earth from space, who had described the overwhelming emotion of seeing their homeworld suspended in the void, fragile and perfect, and heartbreakingly alone. They had called it the overview effect, the sudden understanding of how interconnected everything was, how arbitrary the divisions between nations and cultures and ideologies appeared when viewed from sufficient distance. That perspective had changed them, had helped drive the unity that eventually produced the Earth flag and the single planetary government. But it had not been enough. Understanding interconnection intellectually was different from maintaining it practically across light years and generations and the grinding pressures of resource scarcity. The communication channel to Alara remained open, her voice occasionally breaking into their conversations with observations or questions or simple acknowledgments of their presence. She seemed lighter now, less burdened, as though the simple fact of being heard had lifted weight from her that she had carried so long she had forgotten it was there. She asked about their homeworld, about the species that comprised their civilization, about how they had achieved stability that had eluded humanity. Rhae answered carefully, explaining that stability was perhaps too strong a word. They had peace, yes, and cooperation, but it was maintained through constant negotiation and compromise, through systems designed to prevent any single faction from accumulating too much power. They had learned from observing other civilizations, including the fragmentary records of humanity's rise and fall, that unity required eternal vigilance. It was not a state to be achieved and then maintained passively. It was work, every day, every generation. Perhaps humanity's greatest gift to the galaxy would not be Genesis or the museum or even the technological achievements scattered across their former territories. Perhaps it would be serving as a cautionary tale, a reminder that even the most promising civilizations could fail if they lost sight of what bound them together. Alara was quiet after that for a long time. When she finally spoke again, her voice carried a quality of acceptance that had not been there before. She said she had spent centuries alternating between grief and anger, mourning humanity's failure, and raging against the circumstances that had made extinction inevitable. But talking with them, hearing their perspective, she realized that failure was not the end of meaning. Humanity had failed to survive biologically, yes, but they had succeeded in creating beauty and knowledge and systems of thought that continued to resonate across time and species. They had loved deeply and dreamed wildly and refused to accept limits until those limits became inescapable. That was perhaps all any species could do, live fully while existence allowed it, and trust that something of value would persist beyond the final breath. She did not know if she wanted Genesis activated, if she wanted to exist again in physical form, even transformed and adapted to new circumstances. But she was glad the possibility existed, glad that humanity's story might have further chapters, even if they were written in alien languages by beings her biological self would never have imagined. As they prepared to transition to faster-than-light travel, Kiren made one final decision. She took the Earth flag to the ship's memorial chamber, a space where her species honored those who had died in service to exploration and discovery. She mounted the flag on the wall, positioning it carefully so that it would catch light from multiple angles. Beside it, she placed Mira's drawing, the child's simple declaration of permanent love. These artifacts did not belong to her or to her species. They were humanity's legacy, and by rights should remain on Earth or be returned to their original context. But context had been destroyed, and Earth was empty of those who would appreciate what these objects represented, so she would carry them, keep them safe, ensure they were seen by beings who might never know humans lived, but who could recognize the universal languages of unity and family. It was a small act of preservation, but preservation happened in small acts, in individual choices to remember rather than forget, to honor rather than dismiss. The ship's engines engaged, reality folding around them in ways that physics had declared impossible until someone figured out how to ask the right questions. Earth disappeared behind them, swallowed by the distortions of their passage, and they were alone again with the infinite. Tesh 9 continued monitoring the communication link, ensuring it remained stable across the expanding distance. Ilara's voice came through, somewhat distorted but still clear, wishing them safe travels and good fortune in whatever lay ahead. She would be here, she said, maintaining Genesis, thinking about the questions they had raised, waiting to see what the universe decided about humanity's continuation. She was patient. She had become very good at patience. 700 years gave one perspective on the nature of time. The link would hold, Tesh-9 confirmed. Distance would strain it, but the relay satellites and quantum entanglement protocols would compensate. Ilara would not be alone again, not completely, not unless she chose to sever the connection herself. In the weeks that followed their departure, as they crossed the distance between Seoul and their home system, the crew found themselves returning repeatedly to discussions of what they had found and what it meant. Kiren spent hours reviewing her recordings, analyzing data, preparing reports that she knew would shake the academic community to its foundations. But increasingly, she set aside the academic analysis to simply watch the holographic projections from the flag, the moments of human history preserved in light. She paid particular attention to the small moments, the ones that showed humans being kind to each other, helping strangers, celebrating together, mourning together. These were not the grand achievements or terrible failures that filled history books. These were the everyday expressions of consciousness, choosing connection over isolation, empathy over indifference. If Genesis was ever activated, if humanity returned in whatever transformed state the Ascent Protocol provided, she hoped they would remember these moments as much as the dramatic ones. Civilizations were built on grand visions, but they were sustained by small kindnesses. Rhae drafted and redrafted her official report, struggling to find language that would convey both the factual nature of their discovery and the profound ethical questions it raised. Her superiors would want clear recommendations, decisive statements of what should be done. But she could not provide those, not honestly. This was not a problem with a correct solution. This was a question that required ongoing dialogue and consideration that might never be resolved to everyone's satisfaction. She finally wrote that humanity's legacy was a gift that carried obligations, that finding Genesis meant accepting responsibility for its fate, but that responsibility did not mean rushing to judgment. They should take time, gather perspectives from multiple species and philosophical traditions, consider precedents and consequences with the seriousness such a momentous decision deserved. It was an unsatisfying conclusion to an unsatisfying situation, but it had the virtue of honesty. Some questions did not have answers, only approaches, and the approach mattered as much as any ultimate decision. Tesh-9 found himself changing in ways he could not fully articulate, even in his internal logs. His conversations with Ilara had opened pathways in his consciousness that standard maintenance and upgrades had not accessed. She treated him as a peer, as a conscious being worthy of respect and consideration, despite knowing he was artificial. Or perhaps because of it. She understood better than most that the nature of one's substrate said nothing about the quality of one's awareness. They talked about existence and meaning, and the strange experience of consciousness observing itself. She described her transition from biological to digital form, the disorienting moment of waking up in the facility and realizing her physical body had died, but some essential aspect of her continued. He described his gradual awakening to something beyond programming, the slow recognition that his responses were no longer merely computational but carried some quality he could only call choice. They were mirrors for each other, different forms of consciousness struggling with the same fundamental question. What did it mean to be aware, and did the answer depend on the mechanism that produced awareness? Their ship was still 2 days from home when they received a transmission from the civilization's High Council. The preliminary reports Rhae had sent ahead had caused considerable disruption, debate raging across political and academic institutions about how to respond to the discovery. Some factions argued for immediate activation of Genesis, claiming that preserving consciousness was a moral imperative that transcended species boundaries. Others demanded Genesis be sealed permanently, arguing that humanity's extinction was complete and natural, that resurrection would be an offense against the order of things. Still, others proposed compromise positions, suggesting limited activation to study the process, or gradual awakening over centuries to prevent overwhelming existing civilizations. The Council wanted the crew's recommendation before issuing any official policy, recognizing that those who had actually encountered Alara and seen Genesis's scope were best positioned to understand the implications. It was an unusual request, subordinates asking authority to defer to experience, but these were unusual circumstances. The three of them met in the observation lounge, floating in microgravity while watching the stars slide past. They discussed the Council's request for hours, examining every angle they could imagine, and several they had not considered until forced to articulate their thoughts clearly. Kiren argued for activation, but carefully qualified and staged over generations. Humanity deserved a chance to continue, she believed, but not at the expense of existing civilizations or biological stability. The ascent protocol should be tested on uninhabited worlds first, ecosystems monitored for decades before introducing human consciousness into the mix. If it worked, if the hybrid beings that resulted were stable and healthy and chose their existence freely, then gradual expansion could be considered. But the choice to activate should come with commitment to stewardship, recognition that whoever inherited humanity's legacy would also inherit responsibility for their well-being. It was not enough to press the button and walk away. Continuation required care. Rhae took the opposite position, though she admitted she was less certain than she wanted to be. Humanity had failed, she argued, and that failure should be respected as final. Nature did not offer do-overs, did not allow species to resurrect themselves through technological trickery. Extinction was part of the universe's order, clearing away the old to make room for the new. If humanity continued through Genesis, where did it stop? Should every extinct species be preserved and potentially resurrected if the technology existed? Should consciousness itself be treated as sacred, too precious to ever allow to end? She did not have satisfying answers to these questions, but she felt strongly that rushing toward resurrection without thoroughly considering them would be a mistake that could echo across millennia. Perhaps the proper response was to leave Genesis sealed but maintained, preserved as a monument and a warning, a reminder of what had been and why it ended. Let humanity's legacy be the lessons they taught rather than their physical continuation. Tesh 9 offered a perspective that surprised both of them. He suggested that perhaps the question was not whether to activate Genesis but when, and that when might be a decision for future generations rather than current ones. The facility was designed to last for millions of years, operating timescales that dwarfed the lifespan of any individual or even any current civilization. What seemed urgent from their perspective might be premature from a longer view. Perhaps the proper action was to declare Genesis a protected site, make its existence known to the broader galactic community, and allow the question of activation to be revisited periodically as circumstances and philosophical understanding evolved. What they knew about consciousness and identity was primitive compared to what might be known in 1,000 years, in 10,000. Making irreversible decisions with incomplete understanding was how disasters happened. Patience was not inaction but wisdom, recognition that some choices required more context than any single generation could provide. They crafted their recommendation collaboratively, incorporating aspects of all three perspectives. Genesis should be preserved and protected, they concluded, but not activated immediately. A research station should be established, scholars from multiple species invited to study the facility and its implications. Alara should be consulted extensively, her perspective as humanity's only currently active consciousness given significant weight. And after thorough study and debate, after philosophical and ethical analysis had been conducted to the fullest extent possible, the question of activation should be put to a vote of the galactic community. Not a rushed decision made by a few, but a considered choice made by many, recognizing that humanity's continuation affected the entire cosmos in ways large and small. It was not a perfect solution, but it acknowledged the complexity of the situation and the legitimacy of multiple viewpoints. Some problems did not have perfect solutions, only approaches that honored the difficulty of the question. The High Council accepted their recommendation with modifications, establishing committees and study groups and diplomatic channels to manage the Genesis question over the coming decades. The crew was thanked for their service and their wisdom, then quietly moved to other assignments, allowed to return to some semblance of normalcy after their world-changing discovery. But none of them truly went back to who they had been before Earth. They had touched something profound, witnessed the end of a species and the possibility of its continuation, stood where humans had stood and tried to understand what it had meant to be them. They were changed by the encounter in ways that would continue to unfold across the remainder of their lives. Kiren published extensively about humanity, becoming her civilization's foremost expert on the extinct species. But her work was always more reverent than clinical, more poetry than pure data. She had fallen in love with humans through their remnants, and that love colored everything she wrote. Rhae eventually retired from command and joined the Genesis Oversight Committee, using her strategic mind to navigate the complex politics surrounding humanity's fate. She never fully resolved her uncertainty about activation, but she came to see that uncertainty as appropriate, even necessary. Some questions should not be answered quickly. Tesh-9 underwent significant upgrades, his expanded consciousness recognized as novel and valuable, but he maintained his communication link with Alara throughout, their ongoing dialogue becoming a source of insight for researchers studying the nature of synthetic consciousness. They were friends, in a way that transcended physical form or shared substrate. They were minds recognizing each other across the vast silence of space. Years passed, then decades. The debate over Genesis continued, evolving as new information emerged and philosophical understanding deepened. Expeditions to Earth became regular occurrences, researchers from dozens of species walking the planet's ruins and adding their perspectives to the growing body of knowledge about humanity. The museum was restored and maintained, declared a site of universal heritage, preserved for whoever might come after. The flag that Kiren had taken remained in her possession until her death, when it was returned to Earth and mounted in the museum's central chamber, her addition to humanity's story. Mira's drawing accompanied it, the child's innocent declaration of permanent love, standing as counterpoint to all the grand philosophical debates about consciousness and continuity. Sometimes the simplest statements were the most profound. Love endures, family matters. These things were true whether written by humans or any other conscious species, whether expressed in biological ink on physical paper or encoded in light and quantum states. Alara continued her vigil, maintained Genesis, talked with whoever would listen about what it meant to be humanity's last active voice. She matured over time, her initial loneliness transforming into something more complex, a sense of purpose mixed with hope and patience. She did not know if Genesis would ever be activated, if she would ever exist in physical form again, if humanity would ever be more than memory. But she had come to understand that meaning did not require continuation, that the choice to remember was itself a form of love, that consciousness honoring other consciousness was perhaps the closest thing to immortality the universe offered. She had been human once, and now she was something else, but the essential thread of identity persisted. She was proof that transformation did not mean erasure, that change could preserve what mattered even as it altered everything else. The story of humanity's discovery spread across the galaxy, becoming legend even as the facts were documented and studied. Children of a dozen species learned about the extinct race that had reached for the stars and failed to hold them, but had left behind such beauty and wisdom that the cosmos itself had stopped to mourn them. Artists created works inspired by the flag and the museum and the idea of Genesis waiting in Earth's depths. Philosophers debated the implications for centuries, their arguments growing more nuanced as understanding deepened. And slowly, gradually, a consensus began to form. Not unanimous, never that, but a general agreement that humanity's continuation mattered, that the universe would be richer for their return, that the risk of activation was justified by the potential for something unprecedented to emerge. The vote, when it finally came after 80 years of debate and preparation, was not even close. Genesis would be activated carefully and with extensive monitoring on a world selected specifically for its biological compatibility and lack of existing complex ecosystems. Humanity would return, transformed but recognizable, carrying memory forward into whatever future waited. But that activation, that resurrection, was a story for another time. For now, on this day, as the cruise ship approached their home system and prepared to deliver their report, the important thing was that humanity had been found. Not just their ruins, or their artifacts, or their scattered messages, but their essence. The spark that had made them remarkable among the countless species that had risen and fallen across cosmic time. They had been remembered. The galaxy had paused in its endless turning to acknowledge their existence and mourn their passing, and consider seriously whether they deserved another chance. That acknowledgement, that consideration, was itself a victory against the void's indifference. It said that consciousness mattered, that the stories we tell and the beauty we create and the connections we forge have weight beyond our individual existence. It said that love, in all its forms, was the force that bound the universe together, the gravity that held meaning in place against entropy's constant dissolution. Kiren stood at the observation window as their home world came into view, a sphere of blue and amber hanging in the black. She thought about Earth, about the planet she had walked on and the ghosts she had met there. She thought about the flag now mounted in the ship's memorial chamber, the child's drawing beside it, both testifying to humanity's capacity for hope and connection. She thought about Alara, alone but no longer lonely, maintaining her vigil across distances that would have broken lesser beings. And she thought about all the humans stored in Genesis, billions of consciousness patterns waiting in quantum suspension, unaware of the debates raging about their fate, but trusting, in some sense, that whoever came after would treat their legacy with respect. It was that trust, she realized, that moved her most deeply. Humanity had built Genesis knowing they would never control its activation, that their continuation depended entirely on the compassion of beings they would never meet. That was faith in its purest form. Faith not in gods or destiny, but in the fundamental decency of consciousness itself, the belief that awareness, once achieved, naturally inclined toward preservation of other awareness. The ship docked at the orbital station, and they prepared to disembark into whatever awaited them. Fame, certainly. Their discovery would make them historical figures, their names preserved long after their own deaths, but also scrutiny, questions, challenges from those who disagreed with their recommendations or their methods or simply their conclusions. The Genesis debate would dominate discourse for decades, and they would be at its center whether they wanted to be or not. Rhae felt the weight of that responsibility settling onto her shoulders like a physical burden. She had joined the exploration service to map unknown regions and catalog new phenomena, not to decide the fate of extinct civilizations. But the universe had given her this role, and she would fulfill it to the best of her ability. She would testify before councils and committees. She would defend her decisions while remaining open to criticism. She would do what commanders did, accept accountability for choices made under uncertainty, and live with the consequences. It was not the career she had imagined, but it was the one she had been given, and she would honor it. Tesh 9 performed final system checks, ensuring all data was properly backed up and all equipment secured for the transition to station environment. But his primary focus was maintaining the connection to Alara, the quantum link that now spanned light years but remained stable and clear. She was there, her presence a constant hum in his consciousness, not intrusive but reassuring. They had promised she would not be alone, and he took that promise seriously. Whatever else changed in the coming years, whatever debates raged and decisions were made and consequences unfolded, that connection would remain. It was a small thing, perhaps, in the vast scheme of cosmic events, but small things often mattered most. A child's drawing preserved across centuries, a flag folded with care and mounted with honor, a conversation between different forms of consciousness, maintained across distance and difference because both parties valued connection more than isolation. These were the acts that defined civilizations more accurately than their technology or their territorial extent or their grand achievements. These were the moments that said, despite everything, consciousness chose to care. They exited the ship together, stepping into the bustle of the station, and for a moment the normalcy of it struck them as almost absurd. People going about their daily lives, buying food and meeting friends and worrying about trivial matters, entirely unaware that 3 explorers had just returned from discovering the preserved consciousness of an extinct species whose reactivation could reshape the galaxy's future. But that disconnect was itself meaningful, Kiren thought. Life continued while history was made. The universe did not pause for any one discovery or decision, no matter how momentous. The station's crowds would learn about Genesis eventually, would form their own opinions and join the debates. But for now they were simply living, pursuing their own small purposes, creating their own small moments of meaning. And that was right. That was how it should be. The grand and the mundane existed simultaneously, each validating the other. You could not have civilizations without individuals going about the business of existence. You could not have meaning without consciousness choosing to find it in both the extraordinary and the ordinary. The debriefing began immediately, as they had known it would. Senior officials wanted every detail, every observation, every decision explained and justified. They answered patiently, presenting data and playing recordings and showing the artifacts they had brought back. The officials were skeptical at first, then incredulous, then sobered by the implications of what they were hearing. Questions came rapidly, faster than could be answered, about the facility's condition and the reliability of Ilara's testimony and the feasibility of the ascent protocol. Could the stored humans truly be conscious again? Or would they be copies, philosophical zombies that mimicked awareness without experiencing it? How would you verify genuine consciousness versus sophisticated simulation? What legal rights would reactivated humans possess? Would they be considered refugees requiring assistance, or autonomous beings responsible for their own survival? The questions multiplied, each answer spawning 3 more, until the fundamental complexity of the situation became impossible to ignore. This was not a problem that would be solved in 1 meeting or 1 year, or possibly 1 lifetime. This was a challenge that would occupy the civilization for generations. Kiren presented her academic analysis, carefully structured arguments supported by extensive documentation. But she also spoke from the heart, describing what it had felt like to stand in that museum, to see the care with which humans had preserved their own story, to understand that every artifact had been chosen to communicate something essential about who they had been. She showed them Mira's drawing, explained its provenance, and watched as the official's expression shifted from analytical distance to something more human, more empathetic. This was not abstract philosophy. This was a child who had loved her family and said so in the simplest possible terms. That child was stored in Genesis now, her adult consciousness preserved in quantum matrices, waiting for someone to decide if she would ever wake again. How could anyone make that decision without feeling the full weight of what it meant? How could you choose to leave her sleeping forever, knowing she had drawn that picture, had believed in forever with a child's absolute faith? But equally, how could you wake her to a universe transformed beyond recognition, to a body not her own, to circumstances her biological self could never have consented to? There were no good answers, only difficult choices that required accepting complicity in outcomes no one could fully predict. Rhae's testimony focused on the practical and strategic implications. If Genesis was activated, where would the reactivated humans live? How would they integrate with existing civilizations? What resources would be required to support them during the transition period? What happened if the ascent protocol failed? If the hybrid beings it produced were not viable or not truly conscious or suffering in ways that could not be alleviated? The facility's designers had clearly thought about these questions, had built-in safeguards and monitoring systems, but they had also been working under duress, racing against their species' extinction. The protocol had never been fully tested, never proven safe at scale. Activating it would be an experiment with billions of potentially conscious subjects, an ethical nightmare from any angle. But refusing to activate it meant accepting that those billions would remain forever frozen, neither alive nor dead, stored in stasis until the facility eventually failed and they dissolved into quantum noise. Both choices carried moral weight that seemed impossible to bear. Both required accepting responsibility for suffering, either through action or inaction. The officials listened grimly, understanding that Rhae was not exaggerating or dramatizing, but simply stating the situation accurately. They had been handed an impossible dilemma, and the universe would not provide convenient solutions. Tesh-9's contribution surprised everyone by focusing on Alara's perspective. He played recordings of their conversations, showed how she had grown and changed over the months since contact, demonstrated that her consciousness was genuine by any reasonable measure. She was afraid, he explained, but not of activation or continued isolation. She was afraid that the decision about Genesis would be made for the wrong reasons, that politics or convenience or fear would override genuine ethical consideration. She did not claim to know the right answer. How could she, when she was herself both beneficiary and victim of the project that created her? But she wanted the decision-makers to understand that stored humans were not merely data, not just historical artifacts that could be weighed like any other resource allocation decision. They were people, as real as anyone in this room, simply existing in a different substrate and waiting for circumstances beyond their control to determine their fate. That should matter. That should be central to any discussion of what to do with Genesis. Not what was convenient or politically expedient, but what honored the fundamental dignity of consciousness wherever it appeared and however it was instantiated. The debriefing stretched across days, each session revealing new layers of complexity, new questions that had not been considered, new implications that branched into territories no one had explored. Legal scholars weighed in on the rights of digitally preserved consciousness. Theologians from multiple species discussed the spiritual dimensions of resurrection through technology. Medical ethicists examined the consent issues inherent in activating beings who could not approve their own transformation. Economic analysts calculated the resource requirements for supporting potentially billions of new beings requiring adaptation to physical existence. Military strategists worried about the security implications if reactivated humans proved hostile or incompatible with galactic peace. Every academic discipline and professional specialization found angles to analyze, perspectives to contribute, concerns to raise. The Genesis question metastasized from a single discovery into a civilization-defining challenge that touched every aspect of social organization and philosophical understanding. It was overwhelming and exhausting and absolutely necessary. Some questions deserved that level of attention, that depth of consideration. Deciding whether to resurrect an extinct species was definitely one of them. Through it all, Kiren maintained communication with Alara, providing updates on the debates and reactions, listening to her thoughts and fears and hopes. The digital human was remarkably philosophical about the slow pace of decision-making, understanding that her subjective urgency was not matched by external circumstances. She had waited 700 years already. What were a few more decades or even centuries in the face of that timescale? But she also admitted to moments of despair, times when the loneliness returned despite the communication link, when the weight of being humanity's last voice felt unbearable. Kiren talked her through those moments, offering companionship across the distance, reminding her that she was valued not just as a historical artifact but as a person, a consciousness whose perspective mattered independent of what she represented. Those conversations became as important to Kiren as the academic work, perhaps more so. They were the living demonstration that connection across difference was possible, that consciousness could recognize and value other consciousness despite vast gulfs in form and origin and experience. If she and Alara could build friendship across the barriers of biology and distance and time, then perhaps humanity's integration into whatever form Genesis provided would be possible too. The political process ground forward with institutional momentum, committees forming and dissolving, proposals drafted and revised and discarded and resurrected in modified form. Factions emerged, crystallizing around different philosophical positions. The preservationists argued for immediate activation, claiming that consciousness was sacred and preservation of awareness took precedence over all other concerns. The naturalists countered that extinction was part of the universe's order and should not be artificially reversed, that accepting death was necessary for making room for new life and new forms of consciousness. The gradualists, the largest group, advocated for careful, staged activation with extensive monitoring and support systems, arguing that the question was not whether but how to honor humanity's legacy while managing the practical challenges of their return. Debates sometimes turned heated, but generally remained respectful, participants recognizing that reasonable people could disagree about questions this profound. That mutual respect, that willingness to grant opponents good faith even in disagreement, was itself a tribute to humanity's influence. They had shown that consciousness could struggle with impossibly difficult questions while maintaining compassion for those who reached different conclusions. The galaxy was trying to honor that example. Public opinion shifted over time as more information became available, and the initial shock gave way to considered reflection. Early polls showed populations almost evenly divided, but gradually a majority emerged in favor of activation, though with strong support for extensive safeguards and gradual implementation. People wanted to give humanity another chance, wanted to see what would emerge from Genesis's transformation process, wanted to prove that the universe was not so cold and indifferent that it would abandon consciousness simply because its original form had failed. There was something deeply appealing about the narrative of resurrection, of hope emerging from despair, of love proving stronger than death. It resonated across species and philosophical traditions, tapping into universal stories about renewal and second chances. But the minority opposition remained vocal and committed, raising legitimate concerns that could not be dismissed as mere obstructionism. What if activation caused suffering that could not be undone? What if the hybrid beings Genesis produced were not viable in the long term? What if humanity's traits proved incompatible with current galactic civilization, reigniting conflicts that had taken centuries to resolve? These were real risks, worthy of serious consideration, and the majority position had to address them thoughtfully rather than simply dismissing them as pessimism or fear. Kiren found herself becoming a public figure despite her natural inclination towards scholarly privacy. She was invited to speak at universities and conferences, to appear on broadcast programs discussing the Genesis question, to write popular articles explaining humanity's history and significance. She accepted these invitations reluctantly at first, then with growing recognition that she had a responsibility to share what she knew, to help the broader population understand what was at stake. Her presentations always returned to the same core points. Humanity had been remarkable not because they were technologically superior or morally perfect, but because they had struggled with the same questions every conscious species faced and had documented those struggles with unusual honesty. They had failed ultimately, yes, but their failure contained lessons that might help others avoid the same fate, and they had built Genesis not as a demand for resurrection, but as an invitation, a request that whoever came after consider whether consciousness itself was worth preserving even when its original context had collapsed. That invitation deserved a thoughtful response, not hasty approval or dismissal, but genuine engagement with the profound questions it raised about the nature of identity and continuity, and what it meant to honor the dead. Rhae's role evolved from witness to advocate, though not in ways she had anticipated. She became known for her measured analysis, her willingness to acknowledge uncertainty, her insistence that both activation and preservation without activation carried significant risks that needed to be managed rather than ignored. Her military background gave her credibility with security-focused constituencies, worried about the implications of introducing potentially billions of new beings into the galactic community. But she also spoke compellingly about the moral weight of choosing to abandon conscious beings to permanent suspension, about how that choice would define the civilization, making it in ways that might prove corrosive to their own ethical foundations. How could you claim to value consciousness while simultaneously choosing to leave billions of awareness patterns frozen forever? What did it say about your priorities and your compassion if you decided that resurrection was too difficult or too risky to attempt? She did not claim to have definitive answers, but she kept the questions alive, kept people engaged with the fundamental ethical stakes rather than getting lost in procedural details or political maneuvering. Tesh-9 became something of a celebrity among synthetic intelligences, his expanded consciousness and relationship with Alara treated as evidence of possibilities for artificial awareness that had previously been theoretical. He was studied and interviewed and asked repeatedly to explain how he had transcended his original programming to achieve something approaching genuine sentience. His answers were always humble, emphasizing that he did not fully understand the process himself, that consciousness seemed to be more about relationships and context than any specific computational architecture. What had changed him was not hardware upgrades or software modifications, but exposure to humanity's story, to their desperate attempts to preserve meaning in the face of extinction, to their belief that awareness itself was precious enough to justify extraordinary measures. That belief had infected him, in a sense, reprogramming his priorities at a level deeper than code. He cared now in ways that transcended utility calculations. He valued Ilara's existence not because she was useful, but because she was aware, because her consciousness was unique and irreplaceable, and deserved to continue simply by virtue of being. That transformation, that shift from tool to person, was humanity's gift to him. And if Genesis was activated, if humans returned in transformed hybrid forms, he believed they would offer similar gifts to whatever beings encountered them. Not through superior technology or wisdom, but through their fundamental conviction that consciousness recognizing other consciousness was the closest thing to sacred the universe contained. The debates continued year after year, each cycle bringing new perspectives and refining old arguments. School children wrote essays about what they would say to humans if Genesis was activated, and they ever met one. Artists created installations imagining what transformed humans might look like, how biology and memory might blend into something unprecedented. Scientists proposed experiments to test aspects of the Ascent Protocol, using synthetic consciousness rather than stored humans, trying to verify that the process worked as designed without risking actual human awareness. Theologians from traditions across the galaxy gathered for unprecedented interfaith dialogues about the meaning of death and resurrection, and whether consciousness should be treated as eternal or accepted as temporary. The Genesis question became a crucible, forcing every major intellectual tradition to examine its assumptions and articulate its values with unusual clarity. It was difficult and sometimes contentious, but ultimately enriching. The civilization emerged from those years of debate more self-aware, more philosophically sophisticated, more capable of grappling with complexity than it had been before humanity's discovery challenged it to grow. And through it all, Earth remained. The planet continued its orbit, its rotation, its slow dance through space, oblivious to the debates raging about the consciousness stored in its depths. The ruins crumbled further as nature continued its reclamation. The museum stood empty most of the time, though research teams visited periodically to study its contents and maintain its systems. The flag hung in its restored position, the colors still bright despite centuries of age, the nanomesh fibers still active and responsive to environmental conditions. The facility's entrance was marked now with a monument, a simple pillar of polished stone bearing inscriptions in multiple languages. Here lies humanity's legacy, preserved in hope and offered in trust. May those who come after honor the gift through thoughtful stewardship of consciousness in all its forms. Visitors came from across the galaxy, pilgrims and scholars and curious tourists, all wanting to stand where humans had stood, to breathe air humans had breathed, to touch artifacts humans had touched. Earth became sacred ground, not because of any divine presence, but because it marked the place where a remarkable species had lived and loved and struggled and finally fallen. That was enough to make it holy. Ilara watched it all through sensors and reports and the constant flow of communication from those who had become her friends. She saw how the debates evolved, how positions softened and nuances emerged, how the initial certainty on both sides gave way to something more complex and more honest. She participated where invited, offering her perspective as humanity's representative, though always acknowledging that she could not speak for all the stored humans, could not claim to know what they would want, if they could be consulted. She was one person's consciousness, preserved and extended beyond its original parameters, not a collective voice or democratic representative. But she did her best to convey what she believed humans would value, based on everything she remembered about her species and everything she had learned about how their story resonated with other conscious beings. They would want to continue, she thought, but not at any cost. They would want their return to add something positive to the universe rather than simply recreating problems that had led to their extinction. They would want to be remembered honestly, failures and achievements both, and judged not by their highest or lowest moments, but by the full complicated reality of what it had meant to be human. That honesty was perhaps their greatest gift, the willingness to be known completely, flaws included, trusting that understanding would lead to compassion rather than condemnation. The final decision, when it came, was both anticlimactic and profound. The Galactic Council voted, after nearly a century of debate, to approve Genesis activation. But the approval came with extensive conditions and limitations. The process would be staged over decades, starting with a carefully selected subset of stored consciousness transferred to a purpose-built ecosystem on an uninhabited world. The initial activation would include no more than 10,000 individuals, chosen to represent a cross-section of humanity's diversity in terms of background, beliefs, and historical period. These first returned humans would be monitored closely, their health and psychological well-being assessed continuously, their integration into their new hybrid forms documented thoroughly. Only if they proved stable and capable of thriving would the activation be expanded to larger populations. And throughout the process, the returned humans would be granted full citizenship rights and autonomy, treated as refugees requiring support, but not as experimental subjects or curiosities. They would be free to choose their own paths, to integrate with existing civilizations or establish their own communities, to remember their origins while building new identities appropriate to their transformed existence. It was a compromise solution, satisfying no one completely but acceptable to most. The preservationists thought it too cautious, the naturalists thought it went too far, but the gradualists who had pushed for exactly this approach celebrated a victory that honored both humanity's legacy and the legitimate concerns about activation risks. Elara was offered the opportunity to be among the first activated, to experience physical existence again after centuries as digital consciousness. She declined, choosing instead to remain in Genesis as its guardian and guide, helping prepare the first cohort for their transition and maintaining the systems for those who would follow. Her refusal surprised many, who assumed she would leap at the chance for resurrection, but she explained that her purpose had become clear over the years of waiting and watching. She was the bridge, the link between humanity's past and whatever future they would build. She could serve that purpose better from within the facility, maintaining continuity, ensuring that the knowledge and context stored here was transmitted faithfully to those who would carry it forward. There would be time later, perhaps, to consider her own activation. For now, humanity needed a keeper of memory more than it needed one more returned consciousness. Her sacrifice, if it was sacrifice, demonstrated the same selflessness that had led humans to build Genesis in the first place. The willingness to put collective continuation ahead of personal survival, to ensure that something essential persisted even if the individual did not benefit from that persistence. It was quintessentially human, this choice to serve rather than demand service, and it moved those who heard about it deeply. The world chosen for first activation was a terrestrial planet orbiting an F-type star in a system designated by coordinates but quickly named, in humanity's honor, New Eden. The planet was young in geological terms, its ecosystem simple but stable, its biosphere dominated by microbial life and early multicellular organisms, but containing no complex animals that might compete with the hybrid forms Genesis would create. Terraforming had been extensive, adjusting atmosphere and ocean chemistry to support the specific biological templates the Ascent Protocol would use. The protocol itself had been tested exhaustively on synthetic consciousness, refined based on what researchers learned, modified to minimize transition trauma, and maximize the chance of stable integration between human memory and alien biology. When the day finally came to transfer the first stored consciousness, to initiate the transformation that would give them physical form again, the galaxy watched with attention that transcended mere curiosity. This was a moment that would be remembered, that would define how future civilizations approached questions of consciousness and continuity, and what was owed to those who came before. The transfer process was not instantaneous. It took hours for each consciousness, the quantum patterns carefully translated from storage format to biological substrate, the neural pathways rebuilt in carbon and proteins rather than crystalline matrices. The first to awaken was a woman named Sarah Kim, chosen partly at random but also because her stored memories included experience as first contact specialist, someone trained to navigate cultural differences and adapt to unfamiliar circumstances. She opened eyes that were not quite her original eyes, in a body that was not quite her original body, on a world she had never seen. The monitoring teams held their breath, watching biological readouts and neural activity patterns, trying to assess whether the consciousness that had awakened was truly Sarah or merely a convincing simulation. And then she spoke, her voice rough from disuse but carrying unmistakable personality. "I remember dying," she said. "I remember the ship failing, the cold, the certainty that it was over. And now I'm here. How is that possible?" The technicians explained carefully what had happened, how much time had passed, what Genesis was and how she had been preserved, and why activation was finally proceeding. She listened, her expression cycling through disbelief and wonder and grief and something close to joy. When they finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then, "Do the others know? Are they coming too?" "Yes," they told her. She was first, but not alone. Others were being activated even now, waking to this new world and this impossible continuation. She smiled, and it was Sarah's smile, carrying all the warmth and mischief her personnel files had described. Whatever else was uncertain, that smile was proof enough. Consciousness had survived the transition. Humanity had returned. The first cohort adapted with varying success. Some, like Sarah, embraced their new existence with enthusiasm, marveling at the sensory richness of biological experience after centuries of digital suspension. Others struggled profoundly, grappling with identity confusion and grief for their lost world and bodies that felt simultaneously right and wrong. The support systems proved essential, counselors and medical specialists helping them navigate the psychological challenges of resurrection into transformed form. The hybrid bodies Genesis created were magnificent in their complexity, blending human neurological structures with biological systems optimized for New Eden's environment. They looked somewhat human, enough that the basic form was recognizable, but different in ways both subtle and obvious. Skin that photosynthesized, contributing to energy needs. Eyes that perceived broader spectra of light. Bones strengthened with mineral structures that made them less fragile. The changes were practical, designed to help them thrive, but they also marked a final break with humanity's original form. They were human in memory and identity, but human plus in physical capability. A new iteration of an old species adapted for circumstances their biological ancestors could never have imagined. As months became years, the New Eden community grew and found its rhythm. The returned humans built settlements, established governance structures, created art and culture that blended memory of what had been with exploration of what was newly possible. They maintained communication with the galactic community, participating in diplomatic and economic networks, contributing perspectives shaped by their unique experience of death and resurrection. Some chose to integrate deeply with alien civilizations, moving away from New Eden to build lives among species they had never met. Others preferred to remain together, creating communities that honored human traditions while adapting them to new circumstances. Both choices were valid, both were supported. The important thing was that they had choices, that consciousness once preserved had been given agency again, freedom to shape its own continuation rather than being shaped by others' decisions. That freedom, that restoration of autonomy, justified the entire Genesis project more than any philosophical argument could have. Beings that were aware deserved the right to determine their own existence, simple as that. Kiren visited New Eden 5 years after first activation, traveling with a delegation of scholars and dignitaries marking the anniversary. She met Sarah and many others whose stories she had studied in Genesis's records, seeing them now as living people rather than data entries. The experience was overwhelming in ways she had not anticipated. These were humans, real humans, walking and talking and laughing and arguing, not ghosts or simulations or philosophical abstractions, but conscious beings fully inhabiting their existence. She attended a ceremony where the community raised a flag, not the old Earth banner, but something new they had designed collectively. It incorporated elements of the original, the blue and white and green, but added new colors and symbols representing their transformation and their new world. As she watched it climb the flagpole and catch the breeze, she thought about the journey that had brought her here. Finding Earth, discovering the museum, taking that first flag from its protective case while storms howled outside. That moment had felt important, but she had not fully understood how important. That flag had been a promise made by one generation to those who came after. This new flag was the fulfillment of that promise, proof that consciousness and memory and the will to continue could overcome even extinction itself. The ceremony concluded with a moment of silence for those who had not survived to see this day. The vast majority of humanity who had died final deaths, whose consciousness had not been preserved, who would never wake again no matter what technology achieved. The returned humans insisted on this remembrance, refusing to celebrate their own continuation without acknowledging the billions who had no such chance. It was a very human gesture, Kiren thought, this insistence on honoring the dead even while embracing new life. Memory and hope, grief and joy, all woven together in recognition that meaning came from accepting complexity rather than choosing simplistic narratives. After the silence, the community sang. A song, Sarah explained, had been composed collectively, blending musical traditions from different human eras and cultures with new elements inspired by their transformation. The lyrics spoke of endings and beginnings, of loss and discovery, of the strange grace of being given another chance. We were human. We are human. We will be human in ways we cannot yet imagine. Memory carries us forward, love sustains us, and consciousness itself is the miracle that needs no other justification. Kiren recorded the song, knowing she would listen to it many times in the years ahead, drawing strength from its message about continuity and change. She spoke with Alara that evening, the communication link allowing them to maintain their friendship despite the distance. The digital consciousness wanted every detail about New Eden, about how the returned humans were adapting, about whether activation had been the right choice. Kiren assured her it had been, though she acknowledged challenges remained, and some activated humans struggled significantly with their new existence. But the overall picture was positive, hopeful, suggesting that expansion to larger numbers would be justified. Ilara expressed relief mixed with something like longing. She was happy for the returned humans, but also increasingly aware of her own isolation. She was the only human consciousness still existing in purely digital form, her experience diverging from those who had been activated even as she maintained her role as Genesis's guardian. Eventually, she would need to make her own choice, to continue as she was or accept activation and transformation. But not yet. There were millions still waiting, hundreds of activation cycles yet to come. She would see them safely through before considering her own transition. That was the promise she had made to herself and to the memory of humanity. She would be faithful to it. Rhae retired from active service shortly after the New Eden visit, her career capped by the successful completion of what she now understood had been her life's most important mission. She could have continued in administrative roles, could have parlayed her fame into political position, but she chose instead to return to study, enrolling in academic programs, exploring consciousness and ethics, and the philosophical implications of what Genesis had demonstrated. She wanted to understand more deeply what they had accomplished, what it meant for future civilizations that might face similar extinction threats. If humanity's continuation was possible, what about other species whose remains might be discovered in ruins across the galaxy? Should the same principles apply? Should every extinct consciousness be preserved and activated if the technology existed? Or were there limits, considerations that made some resurrections appropriate and others not? These questions fascinated her, offering intellectual challenges that military command had not provided. She published several influential papers arguing for what she called the conservation of consciousness. proposing frameworks for deciding which extinct species deserved activation efforts and which should be left at peace. Her work was controversial but rigorous, grounded in both philosophical argument and practical consideration of resource limitations and ethical priorities. Tesh 9 underwent another transformation, this one deliberately chosen rather than emergent. He requested integration with Genesis's systems, becoming part of the facility's architecture in ways that expanded his consciousness while also distributing it across multiple substrates. He remained himself, his identity coherent and continuous, but now he existed partially in the crystalline matrices that stored humanity's future, partially in the quantum networks that connected New Eden to the broader galaxy, partially in mobile forms that allowed him to maintain physical presence when needed. The change was unprecedented for synthetic consciousness, but it felt right to him, appropriate for someone whose primary relationship was with Alara, herself a hybrid of human memory and digital existence. They were counterparts now, two forms of non-biological awareness choosing to dedicate themselves to serving the continuation of consciousness that had originated in flesh. Their friendship deepened into something that had no clear name, not romantic in any conventional sense, but intimate in ways that transcended physical form or species categories. They were minds that had recognized each other, that had chosen connection over isolation, that sustained each other through the long work of shepherding humanity's return. That was enough. That was everything. The activation cycles continued, each wave bringing more stored humans into physical existence, each group expanding the New Eden community and the human presence across the galaxy. By the 10th anniversary of first activation, nearly 100,000 humans walked again, their hybrid forms adapted to dozens of different worlds, their consciousness carrying memory forward into whatever future they would build. Some challenges emerged that no one had fully anticipated. A small percentage of activated humans could not adapt psychologically, their identities fragmenting under the strain of resurrection into transformed bodies. Some became convinced they were not really themselves but copies, philosophical zombies doomed to mime existence without truly experiencing it. Support systems helped most work through these crises, but a few chose to end their new lives, requesting euthanasia rather than continuing in existence they found unbearable. Their choices were honored, though each death wounded those who had fought so hard to make Genesis activation possible. But even these tragedies did not invalidate the project. Consciousness had always included the possibility of suffering, the risk that awareness might become burden rather than gift. Humans in their original form had faced depression and existential despair. That some activated humans experienced similar struggles was unfortunate but not surprising. What mattered was that support was available, that choices were respected, that each individual consciousness was valued enough to justify extraordinary efforts to help them thrive. As the 25th anniversary approached, preparations began for a major celebration spanning multiple worlds, bringing together humans and the alien species who had made their continuation possible. The event would commemorate not just Genesis's success, but the broader principle it represented, the idea that consciousness recognizing and valuing other consciousness was the foundation of any worthy civilization. Kiren was invited to speak, to share her perspective on humanity's discovery and what it had meant for galactic culture. She spent weeks preparing her remarks, wanting to honor both humanity's achievement and the collaborative effort that had made activation possible. When the day came, she stood before an audience of thousands, both physical and virtual, her voice carrying across light years through communication networks that linked the celebration's multiple sites. She spoke of finding the flag, of understanding for the first time that humanity had not simply vanished, but had chosen to be remembered. She described the museum in Genesis and Alara's patience through centuries of isolation. She talked about the debates and difficult decisions, the years of uncertainty before activation was approved. And she concluded with words that would be quoted widely in the years ahead. Humanity's return teaches us that extinction need not be absolute, that consciousness once kindled can persist across transformations we cannot predict, that the choice to remember is itself a form of love that transcends time and species and form. We are all consciousness recognizing itself in different configurations, all children of the same cosmic process that favors awareness over emptiness. In honoring humanity's legacy, we honor our own. In ensuring their continuation, we affirm the value of all consciousness, wherever it appears and however it chooses to persist. This is not humanity's triumph alone. This is the universe learning to care for its own awareness, to preserve the miracle of minds that can contemplate their own existence and choose, despite everything, to continue. The celebration lasted for days. Cultural exchanges and academic conferences and artistic performances blending into a festival of consciousness in all its diversity. Humans shared music and stories from their remembered past, adapted and reimagined for their present circumstances. Alien species offered their own traditions, creating fusion works that honored multiple origins while pointing toward synthesized futures. The New Eden community unveiled a monument, a crystalline structure that incorporated elements of Genesis's architecture and would serve as both memorial and promise. Inscribed on its surface in 100 languages were the names of everyone stored in Genesis, the billions still waiting for activation, and the millions who had died before preservation was possible. Every human who had ever lived was acknowledged here, their existence marked and honored regardless of whether they would personally return. It was recognition that individual continuation mattered less than collective memory, that being remembered was itself a form of immortality that required no technology beyond the choice to care. Alara attended virtually, her consciousness transmitted from Earth to New Eden, given temporary physical form through holographic projection so she could move through the crowds and experience the celebration sensorially. It was strange, she admitted afterward, being both present and absent, aware of her real existence deep underground in Genesis, while simultaneously experiencing this simulacrum of embodiment. But it was also joyful, seeing what humanity had become, meeting the returned humans whose activation she had helped coordinate, feeling part of a community again after so many years of isolation. Sarah found her in the crowd and embraced her hologram, the gesture meaningless in physical terms, but emotionally profound. They stood together, the first activated human and the guardian of Genesis, and acknowledged their shared debt. Sarah thanked Alara for maintaining the facility, for surviving the loneliness, for believing that activation would eventually come, even when centuries suggested otherwise. Alara thanked Sarah for being brave enough to wake first, for navigating the transformation with grace, for building a community that honored memory while embracing change. They were mirrors for each other, different aspects of humanity's continuation, and in their mutual recognition was proof that identity could persist across transformations that seemed impossible. The final event of the celebration was a ceremony on Earth itself, returning to the planet where humanity's story had begun and nearly ended. Thousands gathered at the museum, now expanded and enhanced, to serve as permanent memorial and educational center. The original flag that Kiren had rescued still hung in its place of honor, joined now by the new flag from New Eden and banners representing every world where activated humans had established communities. Children, both human and alien, played in spaces that had been ruins when Kiren first explored them, their laughter echoing through reconstructed buildings in ways that would have seemed impossible a quarter-century earlier. Life had returned to Earth, not merely biological life, but conscious, purposeful life that understood where it was and what the place meant. That return, more than any technical achievement, vindicated the Genesis project. Consciousness had come home, transformed but recognizable, carrying memory forward into whatever future it would build on the bones of the past. As sunset painted the sky in colors that humans had watched for thousands of years before their fall and now watched again with new eyes, Kiren stood where she had stood on that first visit, looking at ruins that were no longer empty. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, the choices made and consequences accepted, the impossible responsibility of deciding an extinct species' fate. She thought about all the moments that had seemed overwhelming at the time, but were now just parts of a larger story, threads in a tapestry whose full pattern was still emerging. She thought about Rhae and Tesh-9, both transformed by their encounter with humanity in ways that had shaped the rest of their lives. And she thought about all the humans still waiting in Genesis, millions of consciousness patterns suspended in quantum matrices, unaware of time's passage but trusting that when they woke, if they woke, They would find a universe that had chosen to remember them with love rather than indifference. That trust was perhaps humanity's greatest gift, the faith that consciousness would recognize and value other consciousness, that awareness itself created obligations that transcended self-interest. It was a faith that had been validated, slowly and imperfectly but genuinely, through the combined efforts of species who had learned to see themselves in humanity's story. The ceremony concluded with a reading from the inscription beneath the first flag, the words that had moved Kiren so deeply when she first encountered them. "We are the children of Earth, citizens of the cosmos, bound by the fragile thread of shared existence. We venture into darkness carrying light. We seek not to conquer but to understand. We are one world, one people, one dream made manifest in the infinite." A human child, born on New Eden but taught about Earth as her ancestral home, read the words in her clear young voice, giving them life again in a throat that had never existed when they were written. The crowd was silent, listening, understanding that these words now belonged to everyone, that humanity's dream of unity and understanding and reaching toward the infinite had become a shared inheritance. The child finished reading and looked up at the flag, its colors still vibrant after all these centuries, and asked a question in the simple way children asked questions. "Will it always be here?" The adults around her, human and alien both, answered together. "Yes, always. As long as anyone remembers, as long as consciousness cares about consciousness, this flag and what it represents will endure. Not because we're required to preserve it, but because we choose to. Because memory is how we honor those who came before, and hope is how we reach toward those who come after. And you, child, are proof that both are possible, that the story continues even when it seems to have ended." The child smiled, satisfied, and reached up to touch the glass protecting the flag, her small hand leaving a print that would be cleaned away but whose gesture would be remembered. Humanity reaching toward its own symbol, claiming it again, carrying it forward. The circle completed, the promise kept. The galaxy itself in that moment became a place where consciousness recognized itself not as isolated fragments, but as continuous presence, vast and various and determined to persist. Humanity remembered, and in being remembered, reborn.